He awoke to the sterile hum of a medical bay, not the chaotic symphony of a battlefield med tent, but an unnatural, sanitized silence that set his teeth on edge. His last memory was darkness, the familiar burning agony as enemy rounds that found their mark as he shielded vulnerable human troops from enemy fire. And now, this. His body felt wrong, too heavy yet oddly weightless. He tried to sit up, and the sight of his hands made him recoil, pale, almost translucent and crisscrossed with surgical scars. Panic hammered in his chest, an echo of that last fatal heartbeat. He guessed the other troops must have carried him back here before his resurrection process kicked in. As if summoned by his dread, the door slid open with a hiss. He didn't recognize the figure, with its scaled skin and multifaceted eyes that tracked his every twitch. An alien, not his battlefield enemy, but not some medical technician either. Something told him this creature was not a healer, but a soldier. The alien's halting spoken English attempts were grotesque and comical in their inadequacy. He was about to reach for his translator when the alien soldier clicked and hissed, finally pointing at him, and then at itself. "Military. Exchange," it rasped, the words grating. Dread pooled in his stomach. Not a patient, not an experiment, but a horror to be paraded about. Hours later, the sterile room transformed into a nightmare. Mirrors, cameras, and monitors now mocked his undead form. They showed him what he had become, the echoes of a man who had died so many times already. His eyes, once filled with an ordinary soldier's mix of weariness and grim purpose, now burned with a near-feral intensity, fueled by the Lazarus Project's concoctions that twisted his very being. When it came, the briefing was a torrent of words he barely grasped. He was to be a gesture of goodwill, a symbol of both human resilience and the strength of their newly forged ties with the Dithilian collective. Their top military academy awaited, filled with eager cadets curious about the unkillable soldiers of legend. He would answer questions, engage in demonstrations, and be the monstrous face of the Federation's military might. Each word hammered another nail into the coffin of the man he once was. He was no longer a soldier, but a weapon, a resurrected aberration hauled from one battlefield to the next. He was a walking, breathing propaganda stunt. Yet beneath the revulsion, a cold shard of determination hardened in his gut. If this was the role the Federation had thrust upon him, he would wear it like ill-fitting armor. He would show these aliens, not the triumph of the Lazarus Resurrection Project, but the terrible cost of the war that had created him. The shuttle ride to the Dithilian Academy was an exercise in controlled dissociation. He stared out the viewport, not at the alien cityscape unfolding below, but at his own twisted reflection. The hushed voices within the sterile medical facility were now a certainty. He was a spectacle, a freak, and the carefully tailored uniform they had crammed him into only accentuated his otherness. The academy was less an institution of learning and more a sprawling military fortress. Yet, instead of grim intimidation, it pulsed with a strange, youthful energy. Cadets, mostly Dithilian and others from allied species, swarmed through corridors. Their gazes skittered over him, a mix of raw curiosity and a healthy dose of apprehension. His handler, a meticulously efficient human diplomat named Anna Wright, fussed over his schedule. The opening address, then combat demonstrations, followed by a Q&A session, she chirped, oblivious to the churning storm within him. He could play along and be the Federation's perfect resurrected soldier. Or he could do something they wouldn't expect. The opening address was an insult. A silver-haired Dithilian admiral extolled the virtues of the Lazarus Resurrection Project, a shining example of human ingenuity in the face of overwhelming odds. They painted his unnatural existence as something aspirational, a grotesque pinnacle of tactical achievement. His hands clenched into fists within his uniform's deceptively neat folds. The demonstration was where he watered down their expectations. Yes, he moved with unnatural swiftness, the result of endless resurrections honing his reflexes beyond any human norm. But he didn't make it look effortless like he knew he could. Each feint and dodge was punctuated by a grunt, a grimace that was part fake exertion, part calculated performance. The healing demonstration was the worst. A cadet, under strict supervision, inflicted a wound. It was shallow, something his twisted physiology would shrug off. Yet he let out a strangled gasp. The sting of the plasma blade was nothing. The horror was in the way his flesh warped and knit itself closed, a grotesque testament to the violation of his own biology. The questions from the cadets were what he had both feared and grimly hoped for. Were these the bright-eyed soldiers of tomorrow, the next commanders who'd orchestrate wars he might be forced to fight? Some asked about tactics, the limits of his endurance, the predictable questions of those fascinated by a weapon. But others... "Does it hurt?" asked a young Dithilian female, her eyes wide. The question hung in the air, brutally simple. He saw a sliver of his own revulsion mirrored in others, a flicker of doubt about the monstrous legend. "Every single time," he answered. It wasn't a lie, not entirely. The Lazarus Project wasn't just physical resurrection. It was an endless cycle of death, pain, and the fading echoes of the man he once was. The visit didn't turn into an outright diplomatic disaster, but ripples of unease spread. The instructors were visibly disturbed, Anna flustered by his deviation from the script. Yet, amidst the whispers and averted glances, he saw those among the cadets whose gazes held more than mere curiosity. They looked at him and seemed to truly see the twisted creation beneath the carefully crafted propaganda. That night, confined to his quarters, he stared at his reflection. He'd made a choice, a small act of rebellion fueled by desperation. Tomorrow, he might face reprimand, perhaps even punishment. But tonight, for the first time since his resurrection, he slept. Not with the deathly stillness of his kind, but with the fitful, agitated sleep of a man who, just maybe, had clawed back a tiny shred of his own defiance. Anna found him slumped in his quarters, not in the death-like stillness of sleep, but in an exhausted heap. There was a defeated slump in her shoulders, replacing the polished diplomat's demeanor. "The reports," she began, then sighed. "You made the higher-ups exceptionally unhappy." Her voice dropped to a whisper. "They're calling it a diplomatic failure, a deliberate act to undermine the alliance." He just nodded. He wasn't naive enough to have expected applause for shredding the heroic myth they had built around him. But the cynical part of him was grimly satisfied, forged in the crucible of endless deaths and resurrections. They wanted a showpiece, and he'd turned himself into a horror show. "There will be consequences," Anna continued, a tremor in her voice that told him she wasn't talking about his career, but something far more chilling. Reassignment to a brutal front line, most likely. Or perhaps those whispered about behavioral correction programs meant to break defiant spirits. But then her next words were the last thing he expected. "There's another message," her voice barely above a whisper. "Not official channels, untraceable, just a question." Anna swallowed, her hesitation mirrored in his own dread. "They're asking if you did it on purpose." He understood, with chilling clarity. It wasn't just his actions on display that had caused ripples, but the implication that those actions might have been a desperate, calculated rebellion. The seeds of doubt he had sown were sprouting, nourished by whispers and the unsettling echoes of his performance. Someone out there, someone with access to channels he couldn't even dream of, saw his tainted existence mirrored in his defiant actions, not a malfunction to be corrected, but a beacon of dissent. His decision came with desperate clarity. To deny it would be death by another name, an admission of fear, a weakness the Federation had no tolerance for. Instead, he straightened, letting a flicker of cold defiance seep into his gaze. "Tell them yes," he responded, surprised at the certainty in his voice. Anna gasped, but a hint of the old fiery idealist flickered in her eyes before she veiled her expression. They were both pawns in a vast, uncaring war machine, but with his defiance, he had just irrevocably altered the game board. Consequences were inevitable, but fear had become a warped, almost liberating emotion in the form he now inhabited. The waiting was agony. Each shift change of his guards, each sterile meal, held the unspoken possibility of the end. Yet when it finally came, it wasn't in the form of faceless enforcers dragging him to a hidden cell. It was Anna, ashen-faced and speaking in clipped tones. "New orders," she choked out. "You're to remain here. They're sending a specialist for further evaluation." He knew the specialist would be an interrogator, one skilled in breaking minds far more resilient than his own. The Federation wouldn't risk a martyr. They would erase whatever defiance he embodied, turning him into an empty shell, obediently enacting their rigid ideal. Yet, as he waited in his sterile prison cell, staring at the grotesque reflection of what he had become, he felt something he never dared hope for. He had sown dissent among the Dithilians, and he had inadvertently made himself a symbol within the Federation. This flawed, monstrous, and desperate symbol represented something other than the unthinking heroism the propaganda machine demanded. His war had not begun on the battlefield, but deep within himself, and he refused to surrender it without a fight.